Imagine this. You're sitting in your living room, going through some old documents, and you stumble upon a hospital bill from 5 years ago. But there's something off. Your name isn't on it as the emergency contact. Instead, it's a name you've never heard before. Stick around until the end, because what I uncovered next turned my entire world upside down. It started innocently enough. Sarah, my wife of 8 years, had always been a little private. I chalked it up to her being independent, something I admired about her. But that day, as I held the bill with a stranger's name listed as the contact, my stomach churned. Who was Mark Turner, and why was he listed in such an intimate role? At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe the hospital had messed up, or it was some kind of clerical error. I mean, who hasn't had their name misspelled on a document? But a small voice in the back of my mind nagged me. What if it wasn't an error? What if it meant something more? Sarah came home later that evening, her usual radiant self, greeting me with a kiss. But I couldn't shake the unease. I casually mentioned the bill. "Hey, I found this today," I said, holding up the paper. "Do you know why someone named Mark Turner is listed as the contact?" Her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, so brief I almost missed it. "Oh, that must be from work," she said quickly. "I think they mixed up the emergency contacts when they updated the forms. I'll sort it out." Her explanation sounded reasonable enough, but her eyes darted away as she spoke. Something was off, but I didn't press her. Instead, I decided to dig a little deeper on my own. The next day, while she was at work, I called the hospital pretending to verify my insurance records. They confirmed the bill was accurate, and the emergency contact was indeed Mark Turner. No errors. No mix-ups. My chest tightened as a storm of emotions brewed inside me. Confusion, anger, and fear. Who was this man, and what role did he play in Sarah's life? I wasn't ready to confront her yet. I needed more proof. That night, I suggested we go out for dinner, hoping to watch her reactions and look for any cracks in her story. Over candlelight, she seemed completely normal, laughing, chatting, and acting as though nothing was amiss. But every time her phone buzzed, she would glance at it quickly and put it face down on the table. By the time we got home, I was certain something was going on. My next step was clear. I had to find out who Mark Turner was. I stayed up late that night, scrolling through social media, public records, and anything else I could find online. Eventually, I found him, a man in his mid-40s, living a few towns over. His profile was private, but one of his posts was public, a photo of him and Sarah at a charity event, her hand resting lightly on his arm. My heart dropped. This wasn't just a coworker or a friend. This was something more. The moment I saw that picture, my world started to crack. Sarah, the woman I trusted with my life, had been standing next to another man, smiling like everything was perfect. But nothing about this was perfect. Stick with me, because what I uncovered next will leave you speechless. The photo had no caption, but the date told me everything I needed to know. It was from 2 years ago. 2 years. My mind raced as I tried to piece together the timeline. What was Sarah doing with this man while I was at work, planning vacations for us, and dreaming of our future? I couldn't sleep that night. I lay awake, replaying every moment of our marriage. Was I blind? Had there been signs I'd ignored? The next morning, I decided it was time to take a step I'd never thought I would. I hired a private investigator. When I met the investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Janet, I felt a strange mix of guilt and determination. "I need to know the truth," I told her, sliding the photo of Mark and Sarah across the table. "Whatever it takes." Janet nodded. "I'll find out who he is and what connection he has to your wife. It'll take a few days, but I'll keep you updated." The waiting was torture. I tried to act normal around Sarah, but every glance she gave me felt calculated. Every word she spoke sounded hollow. I started to notice the little things I'd overlooked before, how she always guarded her phone, how she'd started staying late at work more often, and how her stories about her day seemed rehearsed. Finally, Janet called. "I've got something," she said. "Can you meet me?" When I arrived at her office, she handed me a folder filled with photos, documents, and a report that made my stomach churn. Mark Turner wasn't just some random man. He was a businessman, divorced, and had been seen with Sarah multiple times over the past 3 years. Restaurants, hotel lobbies, even a weekend trip to a lakeside cabin. But the most devastating part? A receipt from a local clinic showing Mark Turner had visited the same day Sarah went for a prenatal checkup, the same checkup I thought was for our child. I felt the floor drop beneath me. Was it possible that my son, my sweet, innocent son, was mine? I confronted Janet. Are you sure about this? Is there any chance this is a mistake? She shook her head. I'm sorry. I double-checked everything. The timeline matches. When I got home that evening, Sarah was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she prepared dinner. It was surreal, watching her move about so casually, as if she wasn't hiding this enormous secret. I couldn't hold it in anymore. Who is Mark Turner? I asked, my voice low but steady. She froze, the knife in her hand hovering above the cutting board. What? You heard me. Who is Mark Turner? And don't lie to me. Her face turned pale. For a moment, I thought she might deny it, but then she surprised me. He's someone I used to know, she said quietly. It's not what you think. Not what I think. I scoffed, pulling out the folder Janet had given me and tossing it on the counter. You've been meeting him for years. Explain that. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I couldn't tell if they were from guilt or because she'd been caught. It's complicated, she whispered. Please let me explain. Complicated? I said, my voice rising. Was it complicated when you brought him to your prenatal appointments? Was it complicated when you lied to me about everything? She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. I stood there, watching the woman I thought I knew crumble before me. I wasn't sure what hurt more, the betrayal or the possibility that my entire life with her had been a lie. As I stood there, staring at Sarah, I realized something. This wasn't just about me. It was about the life we had built, the son I had raised as my own, and the truth I needed to uncover. Stick around, because what Sarah admitted next shook me to my core. Sarah sat in the chair, sobbing into her hands. For a moment, I felt a pang of pity. But then I remembered everything I'd just discovered. Start talking, Sarah, I demanded, my voice cold and firm. Who is Mark Turner, and why does he seem to be more involved in your life than I ever was? She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. It's not what you think, she whispered. Then tell me what it is, I shot back. Because right now, it looks like you've been living a double life. She hesitated, then finally spoke. Mark, he's someone I used to date before we got married. It ended years ago, but I ran into him again at work. Things just got complicated. Complicated? I repeated bitterly. Complicated enough to take him to a prenatal appointment? Complicated enough to hide him from me for years. She winced at my words, but I wasn't done. Is he? I couldn't bring myself to finish the question. Is he our son's father? Her silence was deafening. I felt the air leave my lungs. Answer me, Sarah, I shouted, slamming my fist on the counter. She flinched but finally spoke. I don't know, she whispered, barely audible. The room seemed to spin around me. She didn't know. How could she not know? You don't know? I repeated, my voice breaking. What does that even mean? Tears streamed down her face as she tried to explain. When I found out I was pregnant, I thought he might be the father, but I wasn't sure. I didn't want to ruin everything between us, so I kept it to myself. I stared at her, feeling a mixture of rage and heartbreak. You lied to me, Sarah. You lied to me for years. Did you ever think about what this would do to me? To our families? I thought it would go away, she said, her voice trembling. I thought if I didn't say anything, we could just be happy. You've been such a good father to him, and I didn't want to lose that. Her words hit me like a slap. I had loved that boy with every fiber of my being. The thought that he might not be mine was unbearable. I need the truth, I said firmly. I need a paternity test. She looked at me with wide, pleading eyes. Please no. It won't change anything. He's still your son. Stop. I cut her off.
You don't get to decide that.
I've been lied to enough. I need to know the truth, Sarah. And if you won't help me, I'll do it on my own. The next morning, I made the call. The clinic set up the test for the following week. Sarah was quiet, almost distant, as we went through the motions of our daily lives. I didn't know if she was ashamed, afraid, or simply relieved that the truth would finally come out. When the day of the test arrived, I brought my son, our son, to the clinic. He was too young to understand what was happening, and I tried my best to act normal. Inside, though, I was a wreck. The test itself was quick, a simple swab of our mouths. But the waiting was excruciating. Every day felt like an eternity as I wrestled with my emotions. I loved that boy. He was my world. But if the test revealed he wasn't mine, what would that mean for us? Finally, the results came. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope, my heart pounding in my chest. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope containing the paternity test results. My heart raced. This was it. The moment that would decide everything. Stick with me until the end, because what I found inside shocked me more than I ever could have imagined. The moment I pulled the test results from the envelope, I could feel my whole body freeze. The letter inside was simple, professional. But the words on the page? They hit me like a punch to the gut. The biological father of the child is Mark Turner. I stared at the words, reading them over and over as if they might somehow change. But they didn't. The truth was there, in black and white, like a weight pressing down on my chest. Mark Turner wasn't just a stranger I didn't know. He was the father of the boy I'd raised as my own for the past 4 years. My world shattered. I didn't know how long I stood there, holding the paper, trying to make sense of it. All I could hear was the pounding of my heart, the loud, painful reminder that everything I had believed in, everything I had worked for, was a lie. When I finally looked up, Sarah was standing in the doorway, her face pale. She must have known what was coming. "Are you happy now?" I asked, my voice shaking with anger. "Is this what you wanted? To destroy everything?" She didn't respond at first. She just stood there, her eyes filled with guilt and sorrow. "I never wanted this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought it would go away. I thought we could pretend it never happened." "Pretend?" I repeated, incredulous. "You thought you could just pretend that your affair didn't matter? That I wouldn't find out?" She took a step toward me, her hands outstretched. "I never meant for any of this to happen.
It was a mistake.
A huge mistake. But the truth is, you are his father. You've been more of a father to him than Mark has ever been." I shook my head, not able to process the words. "You don't get to make that decision, Sarah. I'm the one who's been here. I'm the one who's loved him. But this is not something I can just forgive." I turned away from her, needing space, needing time to think. Everything felt like it was spiraling out of control. The life I thought I had was falling apart. My trust in her, in everything I thought I knew, was gone. The next few days were a blur. Sarah begged me to stay, to work things out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that our marriage had been built on lies. How could I ever look at her the same way? How could I ever trust her again? I spent hours talking to a lawyer, trying to figure out what my next step should be. Custody of our son was my priority now. He needed stability, and I was determined to be the one to provide that for him. Meanwhile, Sarah was desperate. She sent me countless messages, begging me to forgive her, to give our family another chance. But I knew the truth now. I knew I couldn't just pretend everything was okay. Then came the phone call. It was Mark Turner, the man who had torn my life apart. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that I didn't like. "I heard about the paternity test," he said. "I think we need to talk." His words sent a chill down my spine. "Talk about what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "About the future," he replied. "I want to be involved in my son's life." The phone call from Mark Turner shattered the silence I'd been clinging to. He wasn't just a stranger anymore. He was the father of the child I had raised. Stick around, because what happened next turned everything I thought I knew upside down. His words hung in the air, heavy with finality. "I want to be involved in my son's life." The anger I had been suppressing surged back to the surface like a tidal wave. I didn't know how to respond. What was I supposed to say? This man, who had left Sarah years ago, suddenly wanted to waltz back into my son's life, as if nothing had happened. My son, the boy who had called me Dad since his first word. The boy I had spent sleepless nights with, the one whose first steps I had cheered on, the one who had my last name. Why now? I asked, my voice tight with frustration. After all these years, why do you want to be involved now? I've always wanted to, he said, his tone surprisingly calm. But I was never sure if Sarah was ready to tell you. I didn't want to disrupt things. I laughed bitterly. Disrupt? You think you can just step in now and act like a father? You don't get to do that. Not after what you did. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, Mark spoke again, but his voice had shifted. It was more measured now, almost as if he were calculating his next words carefully. I'm not here to fight with you. I just want to make sure I'm in my son's life, legally and officially. I'll do whatever it takes to make that happen. Legally and officially. The words hit me like a slap. Mark wasn't just trying to be a father. He was going after custody. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Could I really fight him? Should I fight him? Sarah's betrayal had already shattered me, and now I had to deal with the consequences of something I hadn't even asked for. Fine, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You want to be involved? We'll figure this out in court. The call ended, but the weight of it didn't. Sarah was sitting quietly on the couch when I returned to the living room. I could tell she had overheard everything. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. You spoke to him, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, I replied, my words cold and detached. He wants custody. He wants to be in our son's life. She looked like I'd slapped her.
No.
You can't do this. He's your son. You're the one who's been there for him. He needs you. I shook my head. That's what I thought, Sarah. But now I don't know what's true anymore. You lied to me. For years. And now Mark is trying to step in, as if he has the right. She stood up, her hands trembling as she reached for me. Please don't do this. Don't let him take him from us. You're all he knows. I took a step back. You should have thought about that before you kept this secret from me. It's not just my heart that's broken here, Sarah. It's his too. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions and decisions. I filed for custody, determined to protect the only family I had left, my son. Sarah pleaded with me, begged me not to tear everything apart, but I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. Mark was fighting for a place in my son's life, and I was going to make sure that, if he did, it would be on my terms. Then came the court date. It was the day that would change everything. I stood in front of the judge, my heart racing as I tried to steady my nerves. Sarah was sitting beside me, her face drawn and pale, her eyes filled with regret. Across the room, Mark sat confidently, his lawyer at his side. He looked like a man who was about to get everything he wanted. The judge called the case. I felt my stomach churn as the legal battle began, knowing that my son's future was hanging in the balance. As I walked into the courtroom, every step felt heavier than the last. This wasn't just about me or Sarah anymore. This was about my son. Stick with me until the end, because what unfolded in that courtroom revealed secrets none of us saw coming. The judge opened proceedings with a calm but firm demeanor, setting the tone for what would be an intense battle. Mark's lawyer was the first to speak, presenting him as a man who wanted to take responsibility for his biological son. Mark sat there, confident and composed, as his lawyer painted a picture of him as a victim, a man who had been unfairly shut out of his child's life. I couldn't help but feel sick. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up, my hands trembling slightly, but my voice steady. Your Honor, I began, I have been this boy's father since the day he was born. I've been there for every milestone, every scraped knee, every sleepless night. Biology doesn't make a parent, love does. The courtroom was silent. Sarah avoided my gaze, but I could feel the tension radiating from her. I continued. Mark Turner had 4 years to step in and be a part of this child's life.
He chose not to.
And now he wants to disrupt the only stability my son has ever known. The judge nodded thoughtfully, but said nothing. Then, Sarah was called to the stand. She looked fragile, her guilt written all over her face. When asked about the affair and the paternity, she admitted everything. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice cracking. "I thought I was protecting everyone by keeping the truth hidden. But I see now how much damage I've caused." Her admission was powerful, but it didn't erase the pain. Then came the moment none of us were prepared for. Mark's lawyer presented a new piece of evidence, a series of text messages between Sarah and Mark from years ago. The messages revealed that Mark had tried to be involved when Sarah first discovered she was pregnant. But Sarah had begged him to stay away, insisting that she wanted to make her marriage work. My head whipped toward her. "Is this true?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she sobbed. "I wanted to fix our family. I didn't want to lose you." The revelation hit me like a ton of bricks. All this time, I had believed Mark had abandoned his responsibility, but the truth was more complicated. He had been kept away by Sarah. The judge called for a brief recess, giving me time to process what I had just learned. During the break, Mark approached me cautiously. "Look," he said, his voice low, "I don't want to take your place. I just want to be there for my son. I never wanted to hurt you." I stared at him, unsure of what to say. He didn't seem like the villain I had made him out to be. And yet, the damage was already done. When court resumed, the judge made their decision. The court recognizes the importance of biological ties, but also values the bond that has been established over the past 4 years. Therefore, I am granting joint custody to both Mr. Turner and Mr. Daniels, with the understanding that decisions will be made in the child's best interest. Joint custody. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or defeated. I had fought so hard to protect my son, and now I had to share him with a man I barely knew. As we left the courtroom, Sarah tried to speak to me, but I held up a hand. "Not now," I said, my voice firm. "You've said enough." Mark approached me again, this time extending a hand. "I want to work together," he said. "For his sake." I hesitated, then shook his hand. "For his sake," I echoed, though the words felt heavy. This wasn't the ending I had imagined, but maybe it was the one we all needed. The courtroom decision had left me in a daze. Joint custody. A compromise that neither felt like a win nor a loss. But this wasn't just about me, it was about my son. Stay with me, because the final chapter of this story will show you how everything unfolded in the end. The following weeks were awkward and emotionally draining. For the first time, I had to share time with my son, my boy, with a man who had been a stranger until now. Mark was surprisingly cooperative, but I still couldn't shake the resentment. At first, my son didn't understand why he was spending time with Mr. Mark. He asked questions that I didn't have the heart to answer. "Why can't you come with me, Dad?" he asked one evening, his big, innocent eyes filled with confusion. I knelt down and hugged him tightly. "Because Mr. Mark cares about you too," I said carefully. "But no matter what, I'm always here for you." The nights alone were the hardest. I would sit in his empty room, staring at the toys scattered on the floor, wondering if I'd made the right choice by agreeing to this arrangement. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed to spiral further. She tried reaching out multiple times, pleading for forgiveness, but I couldn't let myself go there. The betrayal was too deep, the wounds still raw. Eventually, I told her we needed to separate for good. "It's over, Sarah," I said one evening when she showed up unannounced. "I can't move past what you've done. I can't trust you anymore." Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. "I understand," she whispered. "I'll always regret what I did. But I hope, one day, you can find happiness again." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. As the months passed, something unexpected happened. Mark and I began to develop a tentative understanding. He genuinely cared about my son and made an effort to be a positive influence in his life. We started communicating regularly, focusing on our shared goal, giving our son the best life possible. One day, during a soccer game, Mark and I found ourselves standing side by side, cheering as my son scored a goal. For the first time, I saw him not as an intruder, but as someone who shared a deep love for the boy we were both raising. "I never wanted to take your place," Mark said quietly, not taking his eyes off the field. "I just wanted to be there for him." I nodded. "And I never wanted him to feel like he wasn't enough. He deserves all the love he can get." In that moment, the animosity began to fade. It wasn't easy, but we started working together as co-parents, creating a life where my son felt secure and loved. As for Sarah, she eventually moved to another city to start fresh. I couldn't forgive her, but I also couldn't deny the role she played in shaping the life I now had. Years later, at my son's high school graduation, he stood on stage, looking out at both Mark and me sitting side by side in the audience. He waved at us, a smile lighting up his face. In that moment, I realized something profound. Life doesn't always go the way we plan, and people make mistakes. But love, the real kind of love, finds a way to endure. I had lost a wife, but I had gained something far more important, a deeper understanding of what it means to be a father. This wasn't the story I thought I'd live, but it was the story I chose to embrace. And in the end, that made all the difference. Please comment, like, and subscribe, and share the video, and tell me your views in the comments.